Here in the United States, but obviously within the entire Western geopolitical construct, we don't seem to actually pursue any kind of a peace plan. There certainly is a war plan, and we know war is a racket. We understand that billions of dollars have been going to Ukraine, most of it ending up back here in some of our politicians' pockets. We have seen weapons all of a sudden in the hands of Mexican cartels. What is our bottom line?
Well,
do we know?
Yeah, well, you just asked a multi-million-dollar question. I would tell you the bottom line is that there is no real strategy. What we have are large numbers of people at the top of the United States government who are ideologically committed for reasons of globalism and neoconservatism. You can call it diversity, equity, inclusiveness. Well, I don't care, but these people are ideologues. They don't see the world through the same lens as we do. So it would be a mistake to impute rationality to them. If anything, they are emoting. Oh, we've got to punish those Serbs. They're out of control. We've got to go after these Russians. They're evil. They're bad. Well, why are they evil and bad? Well, because they're not like us. And what are we? Well, we're the diversity, inclusivity, equity,
stupidity.
Yeah. We're the ones with open borders that are destroying our own country. And that's what everybody has to do. Now, we've imposed a lot of that on Western Europe, as you know.
Yes.
And they marched down this very destructive path. This is what Orban talks about all the time. And increasingly more and more Europeans in all the governments behind the scenes are making some of the same statements. Mm-hmm. But there's no strategy per se. No one sat down and said, all right, we're going to use our military power for this particular objective. We want this outcome. So what's the outcome look like? Well, if your outcome is the destruction of Russia and your unrestricted access to strip them of all their resources, and essentially divide their country into multiple parts and destroy their leadership, well, I'd say that's an unrealistic objective. And that's about the only thing I've ever heard. No one has ever said to me, well, we've got to come to a solution with which both Ukrainians and Russians can live with. There's no one sitting there like Metternich, like Gorshakov from Russia at the time, Bismarck and others saying, well, wait a minute, what do we want? What's in our interest? And some people saying wisely, well, we have no interest. The only interest we have is peace. That's been my argument from the beginning in Ukraine. I would make the same argument in the Balkans. What long-term strategic national interest does the United States have in these places? None. So what do we want? Well, we'd like to have peace. Why? Because peace promotes stability. Stability is good for trade and commerce. That used to be the American way. That's what we talked about. All of this changed with FDR. It started under Wilson. It's run out of control now. So there's no identified strategic outcome. And that's why you're beginning to hear in journals in the United States, well, perhaps we can live with a frozen conflict, as though the best outcome for Ukraine would be an outcome on the Korean model or on the East-West German model.
Or even Kosovo model.
Yeah. How does that promote stability and peace? Well, we know it doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. So at this stage of the game, I don't think anybody who's in charge has any idea of how to go forward. I think they're looking for Band-Aids, and they're worried about reputational damage. I mean, remember, the Russians have been running out of missiles since summer of last year. And my gosh, where did all the missiles come from over the weekend?
And bullets.
That's right. And the Russian armed forces are demoralized. Their commanders are incompetent. Everything's falling apart. And Putin, as a result, is going to be overthrown. Well, how's that worked out? On the other hand, when you look at Ukraine, Ukraine is in ruins. Completely. As a state, as a nation, it's destroyed. Anyone with a shred of humanity would look at that and say, this is unacceptable. But humanity plays no role for the ideologue.
No.
They're pursuing their war against Russia. They're just using Ukrainians to do it. And
until the last Ukrainian.
Yeah, and the regime in Kiev is just a puppet regime. And by the way, Mr. Courtney in Bosnia, or not Bosnia, in Kosovo, had been concerned. Sure. Because he too could, as you point out, end up standing alone. When suddenly someone says in the United States, we got real problems here.
Yeah.
We need to do things differently. And quite frankly, nobody in the United States cares what's happening beyond the borders of the United States. I mean, everybody knows that it's a big country. Go to St. Louis or Seattle and say, well, what about those Serbs? Man will look at you and say, what? What are you talking about? So none of this rests on a rock hard foundation. And a friend of mine calls it Fugazi.
Yes.
Fugazi thinking, Fugazi strategy. I think that's where we are. It's Fugazi strategy.
So you served under President Trump briefly, although many of us were hoping it was going to happen from the beginning of his administration. But he was somebody who followed his gut instinct, which is what a lot of people really liked. And he was that president of peace. There was no war during President Trump's administration, particularly in Kosovo, for example. He and Ambassador Richard Grenell, as his envoy, consistently talked about the economic development, as you mentioned, the American way. They were not worried about politics, about symbolism, recognitions. They wanted peace and prosperity. They felt the same way, and I know President Trump felt that same way about the rest of the world. He met with the North Korean leader. Do we have any hope that we can somehow vote ourselves out of this mess coming 2024 and continue this path of America first and continue the policies that really were successful under President Trump?
Well, that's a loaded question, Olga. And, I don't have a good answer because I think many of us share in that hope, but many of us also know the way things are going in this country. It seems very unlikely that we could have any degree of what I would call election integrity. There are so many loopholes. Just so that your Serbian audience understands something, we are still living under this constitution that was written in the 1780s. And in the 1780s, when the question was asked at the Constitutional Convention, well, who's going to run the elections that we're going to hold in this country? And remember, we had at that point no federal government at all. Somebody said, well, we don't have a federal government. The federal government doesn't really exist. We're not taxing anyone. We have no revenue. So somebody said, well, then the states are going to have to run the elections. And so how elections are run rests in the hands of state authorities. We have 50 states. Yeah. There's no uniformity in terms of how the elections are executed. I mean, I don't know what it's like in Serbia, but in most European countries, I'm familiar, obviously, with Germany. If you go to the polls in Germany, you walk in, you have to have your documents ready to prove who you are, that you're a citizen, that you're a legal resident wherever you're living. And then you are checked for your party affiliation. Do you belong to a party? And there are members, representatives there of the parties. Everybody looks at the documents, looks at the individual, and everybody has to agree, yes, this person should vote. Then you're handed a paper ballot. You fill that out privately, and that goes into a box. And again, it's all supervised and policed carefully.
Yes.
Well, that's what we need in the United States. And if we had that, then I would tell you absolutely. I'm quite confident the American people would support what you're describing in terms of policy, position, and outcome. But that's not the case. And if you're operating with these phony absentee ballots, you end up with 16,000 ballots for people who are lying in cemeteries somewhere, sure, who are eagerly counted when they shouldn't be, or hundreds of thousands or millions of illegals who are allowed to vote when they shouldn't be able to vote. You end up with these outrageous tallies, which is what we saw. I mean, suddenly we had Mr. Biden, who had more votes from the black community than Mr. Obama. Well, that's quite an achievement, you know. I mean, it's just nonsense. So I think the election integrity question is a big one, and I don't know that I can forecast anything right now.
Sure. Finally, I think we all understand the depth of corruption that keeps coming up from the Biden administration. And you have mentioned some of the same faces that have appeared in the 1990s in Yugoslavia, in the Balkans. Yes, they were younger, but they created their entire legacies, political legacies on what happened in Yugoslavia. And here they are back again, part of the Biden administration. We look at this Hunter Biden laptop from hell and the connections to Ukraine and to many different areas in the world. There was an informant that came forward, and the FBI has the information that the Biden family is deeply corrupt, has received millions of dollars from foreigners during Barack Obama's presidency. And the FBI just told us, and I really need this to kind of settle in with all of us. The FBI told us that they cannot protect the informant that came forward with this information. And they have informed our congressional representatives of this. How is this possible?
The people who currently govern us and populate the federal agencies, the executive branch, are, as we talked about earlier, ideologues. These happen to be ideologues of the left. The problem with ideology is it is treated ultimately like a religion. And the unfortunate tendency is to make the following statement: I'm correct. I, as a leftist ideologue who runs the FBI, who runs the CIA, who runs the National Security Agency, who is running the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, whatever. I am right, and I am morally superior to everyone else. If you disagree with me, then you are morally wrong. I am always morally right. That translates into permanent government. This is how we ended up in Bolshevik Russia with the dictatorship of the proletariat. The left voted itself into power in the United States and has every intention of staying in power. And it's a mistake to look at it from the standpoint of the two parties, because this new dictatorship has lots of support from people who call themselves Republicans in the status quo Republican Party and organization, which is beginning to look a lot like controlled opposition. And for those of you who remember the Sovietized states in Eastern Europe after World War II, other parties other than the Communist Party or the ruling Communist Party, whatever it was called, were allowed to exist, but they were controlled opposition. There were limits in terms of how far they could go and what they could say and so forth. We're beginning to see that on the Hill. And you end up with a small minority of people on the right who are standing up and saying, well, this is wrong. This is not consistent with constitutional law. This is not consistent with the culture and the history of the United States. And they're simply being ignored. So I don't think anyone who has heard this from the FBI about what we call whistleblowers, or as you say, informants, and just so people understand, this is not an espionage case. This is not someone who is working against the government. On the contrary, this is someone who comes forward and says, listen, I've been in this organization for 20 years or 30 years or 15 years. I know what's right. I know what the regulations say. I know what's wrong. These people are doing things that are wrong, and reporting that to the legislative body and urging them to take action. I mean, it's quite legitimate. And suddenly, the head of the FBI or the head of the Justice Department is essentially saying, well, they're on their own.
Incredible.
We can't protect them, which tells you that the men in charge are ideologues who've decided they're right. Everyone else is wrong. Nothing matters but what they believe. And either you agree with them or you are the enemy. This is a terrible, terrible dilemma. And it's something that we have not historically faced very often in our history. It's not going to end well for any of us in the United States. But this is part of the paralysis that grips us in foreign and defense policy. We're on a path over which we Americans have very little influence at this point.